Good morning, Singapore. Let me begin by thanking the Straits Times for this opportunity to speak at the inaugural historic The Straits Times Asia Future Summit. When I accepted the invitation by the ST a few months ago, I was fairly confident that I will be able to make it physically to Singapore. But we find ourselves right smack in the general election season in Malaysia. Therefore, sincere apologies for being unable to address all of you physically, as I must be in Malaysia given the circumstances that we are in. Nevertheless, I would still like to take this opportunity to share with you my thoughts on this timely topic. Turbulent times, what lies ahead for Malaysia and Asia? I will outline some of the key challenges and risks facing Asia and Malaysia, as well as what we in Malaysia are doing to prepare ourselves and what we in Asia should strive for against the looming threat of a global economic slowdown. Ladies and gentlemen, I think, however, that there is little need for a lengthy recitation of headwinds facing the world. In early October, the IMF cut its global growth forecast for 2023 again to 2.7% growth. Besides the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic's peak, this is the weakest global growth profile since 2001. For most part of the world and millions, it will feel like a recession. The whys behind this is also fairly obvious, namely, a sharp tightening of financial conditions, which is raising government borrowing costs and is likely to become even more constricting in tandem with rate hikes in the major economies. The challenge for currencies like the ringgit is to ensure the net effect is as close to neutral. Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, which continues to trigger a sharp slowdown of economic activity in Europe that will further drag external demand for Asian exports and growth momentum globally. The related disruptions to global supply chains have resulted in global inflationary pressure, which triggered the tighter monetary policies in advanced economies, hence making the inflationary pressure severe in emerging economies. So geopolitical tensions and outright conflicts may continue to be the dampener for global growth, even if it happens thousands of miles away, as globalization of the past 2 decades have interconnected our economies. Third, China's strict zero-COVID policy, which, coupled with deepening turmoil in the real estate sector, has led to a sharp downturn or a sharp slowdown that in turn is weakening momentum in connected economies. China will likely recover modestly in the second half to reach full-year growth of below 4% and then 4.4% next year. As such, it may not be able to play its previous role of powering the global economy out of the crisis, most notably the last global financial crisis. While another major economy, India, may help lift the overall Asian outlook, it is not without its unique set of challenges. So needless to say, China's slowdown is a great concern to Malaysia and Asia. This is, of course, in addition to emerging challenges like the risks to food and energy security, as well as the existential threat posed by climate change. So we ignore this at our peril, but we also do our region a disservice by unquestioningly and uncritically going along with the West's prescriptions at the price of our own economic growth. However, it's not all doom and gloom, and there are still bright spots. Malaysia has enjoyed 3 consecutive quarters of economic growth since quarter 4 of 2021. And in the first half of this year, we grew by 6.9%. Our unemployment rate in August 2022 is at 3.7%, or almost pre-pandemic levels. And in August 2022, according to our Department of Statistics Malaysia, the number of unemployed recorded a drop of 1.4% compared to July 2022. Moreover, the World Bank now predicts Malaysia will grow 6.4% in 2022 compared to 5.5% previously, while the IMF has us growing at 5.4%, up from 5.1% previously. In fact, we have revised our 2022 outlook from 6.5% to 7% in the recently tabled 2023 budget. So both international bodies have also projected Malaysia's growth to be 4.2% and 4.4% respectively in 2023. So this is within our projections of 4 to 5% growth. We see all this as a validation of our economic policies and fiscal management since the onset of the pandemic. Indeed, I can confidently say that the economy is on a much stronger footing now than it was at the height of the pandemic. This does not mean that Malaysia is in any way complacent. A storm is coming, even as our voters head to the polls to elect a new government this November. While many economies, including Malaysia's, are recovering strongly post-pandemic, growth is still fragile and will be severely tested with the projected global slowdown in 2023. So here, I want to share 4 key points on what Malaysia, and I dare say Asia, can also do to navigate the tough economic times ahead. First, there's a need for policymakers, especially when it comes to both fiscal policy and broader economic management, to never lose sight of the 3 Rs: responsive, responsible, and reformist. They have been my lodestars since taking over as Malaysia's MOF in March 2020. Namely, that our governments must be responsive, such as via the 530 billion ringgit and fiscal spending of around 83 billion ringgit, as well as the 2 historic expansionary budgets that we rolled out to protect Malaysian lives and livelihoods during the COVID-19 pandemic. Their appropriateness has been validated by the stellar growth number and declining unemployment we have posed in the last 3 quarters and will continue to pose in the second half of 2022. Domestically, fiscal policy must continue to be expansionary. So be it. We make no apologies for this. Policymakers must be responsive in protecting jobs and assisting the vulnerable in coping with inflation while continuing to build resilience to weather the economic storm. Indeed, we have still managed to remain fiscally responsible. The government's statutory debt stands at 60.4% of GDP as at end June and below the statutory limit of 65% of the GDP. Malaysia's sovereign credit rating is better relative to our ASEAN peers. We are aware that our fiscal position must be improved. MOF has conducted advanced study into subsidy rationalization measures and widening the revenue base. We will work to increase our tax revenue to GDP ratio above the current 11% in line with the medium-term revenue strategy and the Fiscal Responsibility Act to be tabled in the next parliament. We have also continued the work to reform the foundations of Malaysia's economy, including in advancing agendas such as ESG, where we tag our spending to SDG goals, improving transparency and accountability, committing to a robust, good corporate governance framework, especially among the GLICs and GLCs. The MOF has also invested in an implementation unit we call Laksana to strengthen the government service delivery and data collection. This helps in not only making sure the assistance reaches the right groups, but also in refining existing policies or designing future policy initiatives that are people-centric and business-friendly. Next, while some may argue that globalization is in retreat following the pandemic, I feel cooperation is still critical between countries. Take the post-pandemic recovery, for example. Whilst each country, understandably, competes for investments and tourism receipts, it may also be beneficial to find ways to work together so that we can generate a better recovery together. Uneven pace of recovery between countries will only widen existing gaps and expose us to more fault lines which can impede regional and global growth potential in the future. Furthermore, better monetary policy coordination between the developed and emerging economies is very much needed so that equitable medium to long-term global growth can be achieved. Perhaps the time is right for us to create a viable international monetary cooperation mechanism. This is to ensure that financial systems are not only effective and fair, but also consider the unique needs of small, emerging and developing countries. Dialogue is good, but action is more important. I am not advocating anything revolutionary. Indeed, the world has done it before. From the 1985 Plaza Accords to more recently, the Global Financial Safety Net, which quickly stabilized global financial markets during the pandemic. Cooperation like this is crucial so that developing economies and emerging markets can grow more equitably and sustainably. If we, in the emerging markets, especially those in Asia, are left at the mercy of global financial players who are looking to arbitrage on interest rate differentials between markets, then we will suffer setbacks in tackling wider global issues such as poverty, climate change, as well as income and healthcare disparities. Third, the countries of Asia and specifically Southeast Asia need to think bigger, faster. Given the heightened global geopolitical tensions, we must seriously consider investing in building a strong ASEAN-wide supply chain, especially for food and energy security. ASEAN was founded because our region wished to forge its own destiny in the face of the height of the Cold War. This has remained a powerful idea decades later. In an age where superpower rivalries are again threatening global stability, we must reaffirm the ASEAN vision. The final piece to the regional integration jigsaw puzzle will be for us to go one step further and invest in building strong ASEAN supply chains in critical industries. Our policymakers ought to be working closely together to identify critical industries where we can scale up to carve a space for ourselves in the global supply chain. This will benefit not just our individual economies, but also serve as a hedge and glue that binds us together against calamities such as the wars and pandemics. ASEAN is an underutilized platform, but if we put sincere effort into regional stability and economic prosperity, it can be the source of great benefit for its more than 650 million population. There can be no Asian century without a strong ASEAN at its core. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, it's absolutely essential for us in Asia and specifically ASEAN nations to empower our youth to be more engaged as leaders, to prepare them now for the challenges of the present and tomorrow. By 2038, there will be 220 million in ASEAN aged 15 to 34 years. Providing education, training, jobs, housing, healthcare, and opportunities for them will be a great challenge, but so will ensuring that they are able to take their rightful place in societies as well as inherit the mantles of leadership. In Malaysia, bipartisan efforts have led to the voting age being lowered from 21 to 18 and automatic voter registration enacted. This has led to around 5.8 million new voters being enrolled, including at least 1.2 million aged 18 to 21. They will no doubt change the face of Malaysian politics. What appealed to older voters may not hold water with them. For politicians now, being on social media is a must, but even that is no guarantee. Communication is key, but what is even more important is engagement. I must stress that enfranchising and engaging them are key to ensure the young are politically aware of their civic duties sooner rather than later, and about the power they have in their hands and the consequences of their choices. I'm confident most of them will choose wisely. I have put the economy on a much stronger footing than I found it, hopefully, regardless of the outcome of the elections, which will be a celebration of democracy, the best party will win. At the end of the day, it's all about Malaysia. Malaysia simply must win. I also note with great pleasure the political transition happening here in Singapore. Your Deputy Prime Minister and my Minister of Finance counterpart, Mr. Lawrence Wong, is someone I respect deeply, and I look forward to have the opportunity to work with him in the years to come. Asia must listen to its young. Inevitably, they will change our societies. But with mutual respect and understanding, there's no reason why this process cannot be done wisely, harnessing both the energy of youth and the wisdom of the elders. It must be premised upon the leaders looking at things in the bigger picture and maintaining a long view and not to be swayed by the temptations of short-termism. This is especially crucial for issues like navigating a just transition to a carbon-neutral society. Climate change is naturally an issue of great anxiety to young people, but thought must also be given to address the risks of disruption of the labour market, infrastructure, and geographical landscape, which could result from any transition, so we can all benefit from listening to each other more. Ladies and gentlemen, it is impossible to speak of every single thing that lies ahead for Malaysia and Asia in a brief span. I have simply tried to highlight what I feel is the most pressing. There are difficult times ahead of us, but so are great opportunities, and also, with hard work and unity, better times as well. The last thing we should be doing is drawing inward or turning away from each other. Rather, the spirit of togetherness and cooperation that have been the hallmarks of post-World War II Asia must be revived. An Asian century is possible, but only if Asians work together to make it so. I thank you all again for this opportunity to speak at the summit. I trust there will be many more. Thank you, and I wish you all a pleasant session ahead.
Thank you, Minister, for that concise but very impactful speech where you outline a clear path and vision, not just for Malaysia, but for our Asian neighbours as well. But let's unpack some of the ideas that you put forward. I'm quite drawn, first of all, this idea of more ASEAN integration, right? It's not a new idea, but yet we find it's not really happening. You know, we've had ASEAN for decades, but that kind of level of integration isn't there yet. And we can even cite a very recent example, I think for Singaporeans, a very real example where they were deprived of good and fresh meat for their favourite meal of chicken rice. So it is a very good idea in theory. To bank on this, what is largely a peaceful neighbourhood that we have in ASEAN, rather than always rolling the dice with superpowers and geopolitics. But in practice, what does a resilient ASEAN supply chain mean in terms of policy? How do we ensure that everyone shares the pain, right, so to speak, rather than some source countries falling into this knee-jerk protectionism during a supply crunch, and also inversely, the importing economies don't take advantage of a glut?
Well, thank you, Shannon. You're right, it's easier said than done, and this is not something new. We've talked about ASEAN integration for a while. In my previous role, I was running an ASEAN financial group. The whole thesis of having such an financial institution is because we can reap the benefit of ASEAN integration. But it's a challenge, right? But what I see in today is that ASEAN is an ideal medium to bring this about. What we talked about in IMF recently, as recent as last month in IMF, the World Economic Outlook, they have reported that the global forecast for ASEAN countries to still grow despite the headwinds that we're facing. That's expected to grow around 4.9%. And next year as well continue to be a positive growth, around close to 3% in 2023. So the Southeast Asian bloc, if you look at ASEAN as a whole, is set to become the world's fourth largest economy by 2030. But as I said in the speech, it's underdeveloped, underutilized platform, ASEAN as a whole. This also means, ironically, that, and with all due respect, it means that, if you look at compared to EU, for example, ASEAN lacks the baggages and the complexities of other bodies. So that means we can explore a lot more new things as well as ASEAN. It is inexplicable, right, that we have not had yet an ASEAN-wide strategic project. So I can give an example. Why can't we come up with ASEAN-made medical devices? For example, we're talking about supply chain. If you look at the raw materials and the initial processing can come from one country, the design and technology can come from another country, and then the assembly can come from another country. It's just an example. So meanwhile, the investment for the whole project, right, can be sourced from several countries. So everyone, every country plays a role. Everyone gets to be a part of the supply chain. So I agree with you. The challenge is there. The challenge will be to ensure that there is a value add throughout the different levels of supply chain, so that the gains can be shared equitably. Right? Some countries can benefit from more. But I'm just citing the medical devices as one example. But just imagine, right? If and when the pandemic hits the world, and including ASEAN, of course, we don't have to scramble for medical devices to protect our population. Our ASEAN population today is around 650 million population. It's a sizable population. So we want to see ASEAN also as a self-sustaining region and also insulated from global uncertainties. Another thing we can pursue is the creation of ASEAN-wide stockpiles. I think we've been talking about this in Malaysia, and I know my colleagues in other countries as well. When you talk about stockpile, it's the crucial items like food, medicine, as well as raw materials, right? This is also another hedge from global supply chain disruptions. And we can see today, right, and this has actually caused added inflationary pressures as well across markets. So how do we bring this about? Of course, we know politically as well, every country has their own agenda and domestic challenges, right? Domestic realities.
Yes.
I think the way forward is, one is to look at targeting. Targeting, what I mean by targeting is that nobody is saying that ASEAN countries should compete in all industries, right? But rather we should identify certain industries where there is a possibility of such synergies, right? And at the same time, regional cooperation. This will create jobs as well as, you play off your own strength rather than all of us trying to do everything and the same thing all at once, but none of us succeeding. The other one is coordination. I think coordination is very key. This is where we have to develop ASEAN's mechanism to start the process, to evolve. We want to look at the problems, monitor the problems, and monitor the success, so that any sort of pain is mitigated. And of course, the key of all this is leadership. We talked about earlier about integration, something not new, but we need leadership. We need a visionary leadership. But ultimately, we all must realize the potential good of this partnership. So leadership, visionary matters. The personal connection between the ASEAN leaders themselves, right? That's going to be key. And as a former banker, I know how important the personal touch is, because we had to operate in all ASEAN countries. Yeah. It is not easy navigating the landmines, right? But it is something, it's about personal touch as well. In ASEAN, it's a lot about that. So doing all this will create the glue that binds us together rather than just rhetoric. So it is concrete. I think it's practically, it serves everyone's interests. But again, it protects us from external uncertainties and eventualities.
You touched on the diversity that we have in ASEAN, and so a lot of these ideas about coordination, about implementing something where everyone can buy into and to understand together, and that's going to be a challenge moving forward. And one of the things that you touched on also was monetary policy coordination, yes. Right? And you probably more than most people have heard the belly aching about the ringgit falling to record lows and the kind of chaos that this causes in the real marketplace, right?
Yeah.
But on the flip side of currency valuations is, of course, for Malaysia, and there are different questions for all the different markets, but for Malaysia, there is a debt sustainability question in Malaysia as well. Yeah. And we know there's a medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, but you get things like COVID happening, political situation, geopolitical changes, and we can't really call these things black swan events anymore now. It seems like the new normal is perpetual state of crisis, right? Once you're done with crisis A, then you get crisis B, crisis C. And you mentioned also increased borrowing costs. That's already in the near-term horizon, right, for governments. So surely there must be something transformative in store for Malaysia in terms of this debt sustainability. And it's not just chipping away at some excess fat here and there, bringing a deficit down by 0.1%, 0.2% every year. Surely there must be something that can be done. Something, as you said, might be painful, but what's the solution for Malaysia?
Well, thank you, Shannon. That's a very good question. And maybe I can give me a bit of time to explain our economic thought, right? So since 2020, especially March 2020, when I held the Ministry of Finance, my colleagues and I have been very clear on the approach of our fiscal policy management. And of course, the broader economic management, where we keep reminding ourselves that we have this 3R, responsive, responsible, and reformist, which I mentioned in the speech earlier. As I noted, we are working, you just mentioned it as well, we're working towards the tabling and hopefully the approval in Parliament when it convenes of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, right? And also we need to, in my speech I talked about widening our tax base when the economy recovers, when Malaysia's economy growth momentum is there to do this. So we have been also at the same time working to increase the efficiency of our tax collection. They all may seem to be gradual measures, but it is deep-reaching and transformative in their own way. So recent events have proven that the government, which you think you know which country I'm talking about, which act rashly on pure ideological reasons, will be severely punished by the markets. I think we've seen that, right? And that being said, it is a fact that our revenues will grow once our economies recover. I mean, of course, there's always a percentage of GDP. we in Malaysia understand this. That is why we are working towards transforming our economy, moving up the value chain, as well as moving away from the reliance of certain commodities. So we are looking at what we can do. You mentioned the medium-term revenue strategy, the Fiscal Responsibility Act is one of them. But what we need to do as a country is to ensure that whatever decision we make, be it the fiscal position, fiscal policy, must also take into account the impact to the economy as a whole. Just like monetary policy, which is obviously independent of the government, but it has to be done in such a way that those measures may be painful, right, in the shorter term or in the short term, but in the longer term, it will be important for the country to have that fiscal sustainability to ensure that the growth momentum continues for the country.
So that was also a way for me to kind of get you to talk about the political economy.
Political
right?
economy, yes.
And also, well, very, very strictly speaking, the politics, which is, in fact, the reason why we're not doing this in person in Singapore. And I know you don't want to get ahead of your party president. No aspiring politician wants to do that, to upset the boss, as it were. But it looks like you are going to run, and you are going to be running in an opposition-held seat, in an opposition stronghold state, right, in Selangor. And can you say now, as well, you are an actual ruling party office holder now. You are the Selangor Barisan National Treasurer, and so this allows you to speak on political policy, as it were. How important is it for BN to flip around constituencies like these? And we're talking about Kuala Selangor here, but also many similar kind of constituencies. It used to be BN seats. BN would win it all the time, right? But then in recent elections, these were lost. And how important is it for BN to flip around these constituencies? And what's the kind of, in a national picture, what kind of impact does making headway in urban seats, suburban seats, which the opposition has been slowly winning from Barisan National, if you can flip that around, and also the fact of urban migration, right? A lot of these voters maybe do vote elsewhere, and you can win their hearts and minds. What does that do to the national picture?
Yeah, and some of these areas is already becoming more urban than before as well.
Yeah,
not
that's
just
right.
So Shannon, as you rightly pointed out, first of all, if and where I contest is up to the party leadership. So we will wait and see.
Yes,
it's a matter of time. Naturally, my party, Barisan Nasional, we only win the GE if we have enough seats, right, to govern, to form a government. And ideally, to do this, we need to win in all kinds of seats, right? Be it rural, urban, even semi-urban seats as well. And we have done this in our long history, and I'm hopeful that we can do it again. You are correct in saying that in seats, for example you gave just now as a seat in Kuala Selangor, attempting to flip the seat where it is already in opposition hands, in a state where it's opposition-run state for years, since 2008, but it's definitely a very big challenge, right? But I think my party, Barisan Nasional Selangor, is up for the challenge, and I personally as well, I never want to shy away from a challenge. So indeed, in order to form the government, as I said, we need to win as many seats as possible, and psychologically, it will provide a big boost to morale of our grassroots if a seat that is urban, that was lost before, can be regained. So if we can see that, and you must remember as well, there are, examples in Selangor, state. This is the first time the state election is not happening at the same time as the election. So the dynamics also is quite different. I'm optimistic, of course I'm biased as well. The Malaysian voters are ready for change and want to return to a more stable government with a proven track record of responsive economic policy. So I sincerely believe that Barisan Nasional and the manifesto will provide unbeatable value proposition for our voters.
All right. Before this, I think a few months back, maybe in August, if I remember properly, when you confirmed your desire to run for elected office, you spoke about how, as a senator, that's what you are now in the upper house.
Yes.
You can't tackle the long-term challenge of fiscal reform because you're limited to
Yes.
6 years, right? And you have to basically run for office in the lower house. So this seems to indicate that you desire to continue in the finance ministry if, as you say, BN wins enough seats and you're able to form government. So, double-barreled question. Is that still the scenario that we're looking at today? That you will be in the finance ministry should BN form government and the Prime Minister is from BN? And can you offer some kind of certainty that when you retable budget 2023, obviously that has to happen, it will be as is or at least close to what was presented last month if BN wins, right? So the thing is that the difference between October and maybe December or whenever budget 2023 is going to be retabled is that we're no longer doing a pre-election budget, right? Or an election budget, it's post-election. We have a government now, we've formed it. And I think what markets might be looking at is whether the election's done, maybe there's less need for populist policies. Is the government going to tighten its belt? Maybe look more at targeted subsidies. You talk about tax base to GDP. The big question people keep asking you, I'm sure, is are you going to reintroduce GST? Things like that. So is there going to be some movement towards a kind of tightening fiscally?
Yeah. Well, let me answer the first question first. As I mentioned earlier, I will leave it to the party leadership to decide if I'm a candidate. If I was a candidate, obviously, we must try and win the seat. And if I do win, and where I will be in cabinet, I think is again up to the Prime Minister at that time, right? So for me, it's to serve the nation in whatever capacity. But of course, the Ministry of Finance is something that I'm already here, and and we are preparing the budget. And you talked a bit about budget 2023. Well, pre-election budget. But to me, the budget itself, when we formulated the budget, was never about it being an election. So it is, we look at the budget properly. It is a budget which is, is an indicator of the priorities this government will have if re-elected as well. But it is a responsible budget. The deficit is actually going down, for example, right? We will, of course, retable it, as you said, after the general election. There may be some adjustments based on the economic scenario at that time. I have to be frank with you, right? We need to see what's the global economy like and also the impact to Malaysia economy. But the budget, if you know, is the third budget that I've been involved with. And the size of the budget actually underscores the continued commitment of building back better, helping the economy back to health in the long recovery. We also look at the budget. It is not just responsible, but it tries to be more inclusive, it tries to be more progressive, but also importantly, it also tries to be more sustainable, right? So, sustainable meaning building resilience against future challenges. It's, it really cements the building blocks we have put in the past 2 years, and we want to prioritize quality spending in the most important sectors, which will give the spillover that we need for the economy to grow, but also developing the right groups that needs, especially the vulnerable groups, to move upwards, and also developing the areas which is more underdeveloped than others. So budget, actually, the other thing about budget 2023 is a budget that, since it's my third budget, but it's compared to the other two, this budget really looked at what the people wanted. So it was actually a direct response on some of the ideas and feedback we have received from the various focus groups. We talked to the formal sector workers, the informal sector workers, the NGOs, the associations, everyone else, and they have thankfully, reverted to us in our discussion groups and voiced their ideas about how to bring back the economy faster. But at the same time being attentive and responsive to as many groups as possible. So the other question you asked is about GST, due taxes or VAT in other countries, and also you mentioned about targeted subsidy, right? So we will obviously not commit ourselves to any drastic measure that was not outlined in budget 2023 for fear of choking the growth momentum, but it's something that we already looked at. Even the budget subsidy rationalization, if we looked at the budget, read budget properly, we are looking at more targeted kind of support rather than a blanket support. But we have to do it in the longer term. And we, like I mentioned in my speech, we need to increase our revenue collection over GDP, which is quite low relative to other countries at 11%. So this has to be addressed in whatever form of new, broader kind of taxation to make the economy more sustainable. Because what we do need is to ensure that the revenue that the government receives is allocated towards developing the country and assisting the vulnerable groups. If you don't have enough revenue, that will be difficult. Then it will be difficult for the country to grow, actually.
Minister, thank you so much again for your time, Shannon, and your contribution to the Asia Future Summit. We wish you all the best of luck for the coming election. And we hope to have you back again with the Straits Times soon. Hopefully still as Finance Minister of Malaysia.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon, for having me. And hopefully the next one will be a physical meeting.
That's right. We hope for that too.
We hope for that.
This ends our session with, I think, strictly speaking, caretaker, Finance Minister of Malaysia, Dato Sri Tengku Zafrul Aziz. Over to you, Lynn.